I'm not your host, but the host of today's show is Leo Cohen with the Cohen Group Northwest.
Perfect time.
I just recorded the end credits.
We're out of here.
Should I make it? Can I make a coffee sound to start, like for the intro?
Ew.
Don't use that.
That sounded more like whipped cream.
Welcome to Building Bellingham. I'm your host, Leo Cohen. I'm super excited about today's episode because I get to sit down with Wes Herman, CEO of Woods Coffee, and we dive more into culture, brand, and the Pacific Northwest roots that create an environment for Woods Coffee to be successful. Throughout our conversation, Wes goes deep into what it takes to make it work, planning for the ramp-up time, having enough capital to run for 1 or 2 years before becoming profitable, sacrificing to make it work. In the early days, Wes could be found changing the oil in someone's car with a phone to his ear, talking over the next Woods expansion. There's so much more about analyzing new markets, taking opportunities others would deem too risky, expanding to 19 locations, and taking Woods from a small business to a big one. Wes is a true entrepreneur. He's vulnerable, he's confident, and he has a vision of what he wants to accomplish with any business that he gets into. Any entrepreneur's path to success is riddled with many challenges along the way, and in this episode, we get to dive in vulnerably to some of Wes's biggest challenges as a human and as a business owner. Mr. Wes Herman, thank you so much for taking the time to come out here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Well, I want to dive right into Woods. How did it start? What does it stand for?
Yeah. It was never about, hey, can we put in one store and then see how it goes? It was always about building multiple locations. So after opening our first store, it was 6 months later, we opened our second store. Really exciting times, a lot of energy around that type of movement and tons of things to learn. I tell people all the time, the biggest growth in your company is going from 1 to 2, because you have to perfect your systems and you have to perfect, consistencies and making sure that everything works identical from 1 to 2. And we're talking about 1 to 2 units, not, all the other things. So anyway, we had this idea of doing multiple stores, and we start out and we're growing it. But just before that, if you go back and you're saying, how does this all come about? What's this look like? When you say, oh, you wrote a business plan and you go do it. Yeah, okay, that's fine. But the nuts and bolts of it are this. The hardest thing when you start a business is, what are you going to name that business? It's not easy like you, where you can just name it after yourself.
That wasn't how I name a business. How'd you know? You caught me.
So the idea is that we would write down names on a piece of paper and we'd cross them off. We'd write down names and cross them off, and this happened for weeks. And we just couldn't come up with a solid name. And because the name not only had to have name, but it had to have, what the aesthetics are going to look like. What's this whole, culture going to be? There's so many factors that we're weighing in that name. And so at one point we just got frustrated and said, hey, no more talk about the name. We're going to take a break, and maybe a week from now we'll pick it back up. And my 19-year-old daughter came back a week later and said, Dad, I got it. We're going to call it Woods Coffee. And it's going to be around the environment, and it's going to be the Pacific Northwest, and we're going to theme the store so it looks like this, and it'll be a winner. Well, the light bulb went off for me when she said that, because I had been traveling in the Northeast, and there was a company back there called Caribou Coffee. And Caribou had a little bit of that, what we call the PNW feel to it.
Yep.
So the idea, the light bulb went off and said, okay, yeah, that works. And yes, we can do that. And so then we were just full on, and we went for it from there forward. The idea of how you execute that, and this is a more behind the scenes kind of stuff. Again, we didn't have the money at that point to do it. Done a few things,
This is location 1.
Yeah. And so we found the location. I'm traveling in Algonquin, Illinois, and I see a Starbucks, and it has this little sign that says drive-through with an arrow around the back. Now, it's really easy for us today to say, Well, drive-through coffee shops are everywhere, right? Well, in the day, 18 years ago, there weren't those type of environments. You would see a drive-through stand, a stand that stands alone that, is just you can't go in there and sit down. You just have to drive through. Or you'd have the sit down with drive-through. And there was really one example of that. And that was a Starbucks down at Seahome Village in Bellingham. And that one was an old A&W root beer, it had been converted. And but that was a sit down with drive-through. Well, now what I was looking for was a sit down with drive-through, but how could and we'd identified that we needed to do both. And, one or the other wasn't it. We needed to do both. But the idea of putting it in the middle of a strip center, we didn't see that around here. We saw sit down only, but not with the drive-through. And so when I saw this Starbucks with the drive-through in Algonquin, Illinois, I pulled off the highway, drove around, and realized that they had a drive-through in the back alley. And it was kind of an interesting concept. And the light bulb went off because I'd seen a store exactly like that in Linden, Washington. And so went back home to Linden, Washington, and went straight to the city and said, hey, you've got this new property up here, and it's got a fire lane in the back. Could I put a drive-through in there and make this work with traffic and flow and all that? And they said, sure. So then I went back, we signed the lease immediately, and we had done something that a lot of people hadn't done at that point. So we'd drawn the business plan, and we needed $23,000.
And this is the Pender Road location, correct?
Pender Road,
yeah,
Linden, Washington.
Yeah.
So I identified that we needed $23,000 to pull this thing off. And so I went to a friend who was not a coffee guy, didn't drink coffee at all. And I said, hey, I've got this great concept. Here's what I want to do. I need $23,000. And if you'll partner with me, we can pull this off. And he said, sure. So with $23,000 of partnered money, we went after this thing and started that first store. And then we actually took a second partner on to do our second store. And then it just kept rolling and so on and so forth.
You talk about developing systems, especially on the first location is going to be the one where you develop all of your systems. And tell me more about the successes and failures of how you develop these systems for location one and then rolled that into location two.
Yeah. So backing up for a second here, I think one of the key things about an entrepreneur that creates a lot of failure is when entrepreneurs don't set aside enough capital to get them through the difficult startup period. And the startup period is typically about a year, could lead to 2 years. Or longer, depending on whatever it is you're doing. But in the case where you're starting something up and you have a ramp up time, in my case, we specifically did not want to put a drag on the business of my income because I was probably the most expensive income at that point. I actually bought another business and went to work in that business just so that we could not put the drag on the coffee company. But back to your idea of systems. The systems are key for us. Back to the startup or the product development company in Bellingham, we'd learned a lot about Kaizen and Lean, and so we started implementing a lot of that in what we were doing in design of the stores, and also the flow of the store and the function and where you set things up and how you set them up. There's not a real lean expert in food and in restaurants, and so we had to build these systems ourselves. And that was a great thing for us. It gave us opportunity to create and be diverse in what we were doing. But going from one store to two stores was now we were seeing, okay, we're going to open soon on this second store, 6 months in. It's not like we're killing it in our first store. We're actually doing a little smoke and mirrors stuff, hey, we need to show that we're actually aggressive and we're growing and that we own this market. After all, we're in Linden, Washington, 6,000 people, and, put a second store in, that's going to bring a lot of attention. And it did. And it drove sales in both stores, and they both grew. but we had to have those systems down. And even early on, the way we were doing our caramel sauce was not working correctly. We needed this really nice caramel that was a great flavor and that it flowed, but to manage that caramel was complicated. It came in a can, and you had to put it into a squeeze thing, and how do you do this? And it didn't flow right, and it's too thick, and so we figured out, well, just put the can in the sanitizer, let it run for a 2-minute cycle. It gets hot, it's much more fluid, and then we can pour it. And so just little things like that, that are crazy to think about now, and then it's like, how do you document all this? How do you make sure that your manuals are correct and everybody understands what you're doing and that we're all on the same page? And then you can go from store number 1 to store number 2 and work in both those stores and not feel like you're in 2 different places. And how do you deliver experience that is identical from one store to the next? And, so we learn all those things as we go along. We're into store number 2. We'd been open for a few days. And I started getting calls from friends and saying, hey, I was in your newest store and there's a problem. The drink doesn't taste the same. And so, I went running back to the store and said, hey guys, there's a problem. What is it? Let's go through the systems. And we're looking things, we're pulling, we're looking coffee, looking at chocolate, we're looking at everything. And I said, okay, well, how about this? Let's just make a drink. All right. And I went, opened the refrigerator and I pulled out the milk and I said, hey, where'd this milk come from? Who brought this milk in here? They said, oh, we ran out of milk yesterday. It was so busy yesterday. We had to go next door to the grocery store and buy this milk. And I said, this is the problem. This is what everybody is got the problem. It's a different milk. And so sure enough, we tested the milk and tested this and boom, that was the identifier. So we identified that was a problem. So say, hey guys, you know what? You don't deviate from what we do. Even though you're solving a problem, you still have to fix it, in a logical way and stay with the same products that we have. So that's how we solved that problem. And we brought those same people back in and said, okay, now taste this. Is it right? And they said, yep, everything's good.
Problem solved.
Yeah. So it's just one of those little funny deals.
So what I want to dive into about this is your attention to detail. You don't have to necessarily be a detail person until you're running your own business, and then all of a sudden details become really important because it's your passion, it's your vision. Tell me a little bit more about what that's like when you have this attention to detail about things like caramel and milk and all the things that go into making a good coffee. And somebody else, maybe you have someone that has just joined, they don't really understand the culture yet, they don't understand the attention to detail yet. What's that like for you from a patient standpoint, getting someone up to speed on details like that?
I'm an impatient kind of guy. Like things done quickly because I believe that, faster you go, you stay ahead of your competition. There's all kinds of reasons, but the attention to detail, I'm not a detail kind of guy. And yet I am very intentional about all the details because I view things from the guest experience. So when people come into our stores, I want them to have an identical experience in every store, and I don't want them to be frustrated. I want them to get speed and efficiency and understand what we're doing, and enjoy the experience. And so all those little details are things that I was intentional about because I was building a brand. I was building a brand around, something that we believed so strongly in that we had to make sure that everything was right. And so when you talk about those details, I was very patient. I don't know about that, but I was trying to be as patient and just working through all those details. And those details take time, right? We built our third store within 2 years. And, and all these stores, the first 3 were in Linden because we were going to take ownership of a city and understand how to make that work before we went to the big city of Bellingham.
That's awesome. So now you're in 2 places. At this point, with these 2 locations going, you have your other business going as well. Are you making any money yet?
No, we
Tell me about that.
We went a full year before we actually turned into the black. I had to go work, this other business, and the other business was a oil business. So it was a lube shop, and so we would change oil in cars, and so oftentimes I would be changing an oil in a car with a phone to my ear while the oil's coming out of the bottom of the car. and I'm making a deal on the next store, so. But back to that first year, yeah, we didn't make any money in that first year. We had prepped for that. We knew that what it would take to get to that place. And then at 1 year, right about 1 year, both the stores turned into the black, and then kept going from there.
Did you celebrate with a coffee?
Black coffee.
Black coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very black coffee.
Very appropriate.
Yeah.
Yes.
I want to carry that message forward. You're not going to be profitable right away, and that's okay. That doesn't mean your business is failing, especially when you're in growth mode. Tell me a little bit more about, because you guys have clearly been in growth mode. You guys are scaling, but you're not growing at a pace where you lose the quality. Tell me a little bit more about what that means to grow a brand and a culture where you're growing and you're able to keep scaling,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not losing the level of quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a couple things there that are key. There was a time, when we got down, we were at a place in 2008. I don't know if that number rings a bell, but for most people it does. And things were not great in the economy. But right around that time, we built 6 new stores in an 18-month period. And the key to that was that we were bucking the trend. And I remember doing interviews with primarily newspapers and a few other things that people wanted to know, well, what are you doing differently? Why is it that you're growing during a time when, people are contracting? And I said, well, we're taking advantage of the opportunity. Starbucks was cutting stores at that point, and we were growing stores. We took over 2 sites that they were in the midst of opening. And, that was kind of a key for us. And during that time, growing 6 stores in an 18-month period, we didn't have the manpower. We didn't have the people who had grown up in our culture. And so we suffered in our guest experience. And we had to retool. We had to work hard to get everybody up to speed. Now we are a little more intentional about how we build that. And we're able to train people long in advance of going into a new store. And so this is front of mind right now because we're going to open a new store in just a few weeks. And we actually were supposed to open this week. And we chose to postpone it because our staff was not ready.
So it looks like you, at that time, bucking the curve, bucking the trend, meaning that you, while everybody else is contracting, you're expanding because you've spent the good years, and I'm doing air quotations, saving and not necessarily, not moving forward, but also preparing for a time when there's opportunity and you have more capital.
Exactly.
But what you're saying that came as kind of a balance to that was the fact that when you expanded that quickly and you had all this opportunity, the quality at that point kind of lagged behind. And so this was something that you had struggled with at that point.
And we had to learn and teach a lot of systems, new systems. How do we train for that? If we're going to expand, I remember going from, 50 to 100 employees, and now, we're 300 going to 400. And, how do you do that? How do you manage all those people so that they're delivering that same guest experience everywhere you go? And so just had a meeting yesterday where we're producing some more training materials that tell the story maybe in a little different way, so that people understand who work for us, what we're looking for and, what we expect.
So what are you looking for and what do you expect in that person that, versus the first person that you hired, you probably didn't have, you had expectations of what you wanted done, but it wasn't probably as systematized or as, solidified of a culture and a brand as it is now. What's the difference between that first person you hired to the 50th person you hired?
Right. Almost no difference. And I'll tell you why, because it really comes down to one thing, and that is service. We've built our identity and our brand around how we service a guest. And a genuine experience, we may not have all the lingo down. We may not be able to tell you exactly everything about a certain coffee from a certain region, with all the flavor profiles and things like that, because we don't have that huge team that creates materials, that hands it off to people that they can read and then, just spew information because it's information. So ours is more about, hey, what's a genuine experience look like? What's that service look like when you can bring somebody into your space, invite them in, and then give them something very special that they enjoy and that they feel that there's value for what they just spent. And so that's never changed. It's been the same since day one, that we're all about service. Our three statements are serve others, make a difference, and have fun. And if we can do those three things collectively at the same time, then we're going to deliver what we call a Q10 experience.
I love it. And there's a lot of John Muir quotes around that I see, and I'm not incredibly familiar with all of John Muir, the stories, but I did hike Yosemite, and my grandparents were big fans. And one of your big statements is "Come to the woods, for here's the rest." What does that mean to you?
It's that's a great phrase. It might be on the cup that you're holding right there. But the idea of the Muir quotes, I grew up backpacking. I had an uncle who took me backpacking in California all my years growing up, and we were on the John Muir trails all the time. And so when you talk about brand and identity and culture, these were just natural things that came along with what I knew of John Muir, who was an outdoorsman who, created a trail system that, was named after him all around California. And it's meaningful to me because of the quotes. Now, you asked me specifically about one quote, and that quote, by the way, is very prominently displayed at California Adventure. And
is it really?
Yeah, and I get that sent to me many times because it's up on a building and it faces out and it's very prominent. And people take pictures of that and then send it to me and say, "Hey, they've got the same quote too." And we had it before they did, I believe. But the point,
quick statement, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the point is that it's just a fun thing. The woods is supposed to be a place of rest, right? And when we talk about places that we remember, those memories you have in the woods, in the trees, when you can smell that air and you can sense that breeze blowing through those trees and the temperature and all those kind of things, that's what we want. We want that experience. And so coming to the woods, in our case, Woods Coffee, should be a place of rest. You should enjoy what you're coming to experience.
Rest while you're getting amped up on
a
nice cup of joe.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit, let's dive into brand and then I want to dive into culture. So first of all, brand.
Yeah.
And that's something I actually talked with Jesse Nelson a lot about, which was how does brand stand apart, especially in an industry where, in the Northwest, there's some heavy hitters in the Northwest. You're one of them, but you came into an industry where there's Starbucks, there's Seattle's Best, is there Pike's Place? Is that another?
You're probably thinking of Tully's. You're
Tully's.
talking about all the brands that have dominated in the Pacific Northwest for many years. But there's really only clear one leader, and that is Starbucks, and there's no question about it. We view them as our parent company because if they didn't exist, we wouldn't exist. They have blazed a trail. We like to think that we have done things slightly differently, and we've delivered on some value-added promises that we want to do within our culture and within our company. The brand is a unique brand, our brand. Just like Starbucks is a unique brand, and they've done an amazing job. And so we're piggybacking and learning and watching and kind of creating our own as we go. The brand identity, we've changed the logo, we've changed, some of the visuals, but in the end, it's, a strong brand identity, and we get people now from, all over the United States asking about our brand, wanting to buy our merchandise online, wanting to buy our coffee online, all that kind of stuff is just building that strong brand.
Well, that's fantastic, and I think it's a really great perspective to have that humility to say, well, they came before us, and they're huge, but you have a very prominent brand here in the Northwest. Besides being that place of rest, which especially the Barkley location, which is close to where I live, I go in there, I can go sit by the fire. There's all sorts of different elements that you guys have created in that environment for rest or for productivity in the conference room upstairs that you can rent. Tell me a little bit more about
rent for free.
Rent for free. Sorry. Yeah. Let me clarify that. You have to reserve it.
There you
go. But in a market where you're coming in, and was there a Starbucks in Linden at that time?
There was not.
That's
No.
an opportunity.
Yeah, we thought so.
Yeah.
There were a couple other coffee shops, and they did fine. But we knew that we could deliver a different experience, and we had to create that. Like it didn't just happen overnight. And by the way, if I can throw one thing that keeps coming back to mind, I just met with a coffee shop owner in Seattle who's struggling to get their brand going, and I was explaining to him. I said, well, maybe you should consider not being such a drag on this business financially yourself. It took me until store number 6 before I could actually take an income from the Woods Coffee. So I was back here working this other job until store number 6. And when I told him that, he's a young guy, that had this idea, well, you just start a business, right? And this is how you go and boom, boom, boom. And I said, no, it's dirty. It's messy. You got to get in there and work hard at it. And so when I told him, I said, hey, I never pulled any money out of the company until it's store number 6. And he just stopped and he said, I can't believe that. I've never heard of anything like that. And as an entrepreneur, you have to be passionate about what you're doing. One, yes, but it takes a lot of hard work, and you got to figure a way to make it work in different ways than everybody else thinks it should be done.
And we are the easiest controlled variable to ourselves. Am I right? I mean,
Absolutely.
It sounds like kind of, a truism, but I'm doing the same thing right now. I'm still, I'm almost 3 years in now with just the Cohen Group, and I've been in business 7 years, but I'm still trying to make sure that I am the least drag on the company, because I could, pay myself what I think I'm worth, just like you could have paid yourself what you thought you were worth.
Sure.
But when you're doing what you love, what you're saying is you should be willing to take nothing to be the least amount of drag on your company until you can get it off the ground.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So how important is brand in an up market and a down market? What is that like? Because you have merchandise, you guys are selling coffee all around the country. There's a certain thing that you have solidified, you've attached yourself to, which is this feeling of being in the woods. That's part of what you're trying to create. Why is that important, that experience, when you go into a market where there's presumably more coffee shops popping up or a Starbucks popping up on 3 different corners around you? Why is that branding so important?
For us, it's a lifestyle brand. It's not your typical, brand of just commerce where you're buying a widget. And, we are selling something that is part of your life. And so when we talk about brand identity and what it looks like, we use a lot of the outdoors imagery and things like that, because we think that is part of the experience. And so when we talk about what our brand identity is, it's not just, what's your logo, what's your name. It's, what's the cup look like? How did we present that? And what's our interiors look like? I've always believed that the inside of our stores are so important to the drive-through guest, because at some point they've been inside our stores. They understand what that store looks like. And when they're in the drive-through, they're envisioning what that is. And that brings an added value to the cup of coffee that we're handing them out of a window.
So that's what separates from the transactional, here's a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Typically they're white. Is it a white cup?
Where, in a Starbucks, you mean?
Well, this is something that I've noticed, is that traditionally a coffee cup is white with a black lid.
Yeah.
I've seen and
all it's so funny you say that, because from the very beginning, Starbucks was a white cup with a white lid. And we believed that we'd heard enough people say, I hate the fact that my lipstick shows up on that white lid. And so when we started, we went with a white cup with a black lid. Nobody did that. In fact, the black lids were so short in supply that we were starting to use so many by about store 3, 4 that we would have to drive up and down the I-5 corridor to stop at various places that sold boxes of lids to buy enough black lids to supply us, because our regular supplier didn't have enough black lids. We were using so many. And now, when you say it's common, yes, it is common. It wasn't in that day, and we had created something different. And to this day, that's something we love, is the fact that a woman can, or a man, can use a black lid and the lipstick doesn't show up.
Very, very cool. So it's almost like you're growing as Starbucks is growing, but you're also, it's the black on black and the white on white.
There you go.
It's kind of the spy
black
versus spy.
Yeah,
if you've ever
yeah.
read Spy versus Spy. Yeah.
Black hat versus white hat. There
Black
you
hat
go.
versus white hat.
Yeah.
So culture, that's something that I know you guys are big on. Tell me a little bit more about the Woods culture. How has that grown? How has that developed? What is it about?
Yeah, culture is everything to us, and we preach our culture starting with our staff and making sure that they are part of. One of the big things is, what's culture? How can you identify culture? And we talk a lot about culture, and you would have something to say about culture in your business. Jesse would have something to say about culture in his business, and in the end. It's more about a feeling, right? We don't necessarily identify in a written format what is that culture.
We're all here for a reason.
Yeah.
What is that reason?
Yeah. So in our case, it's the culture is everything, and we talk about that. We talk about what's the culture in our office. How does that expand out to the culture within our bakery, in our roastery, the guys that are doing the distribution, the guys that are doing the delivery. And then how does it ultimately serve everybody that's in our store? So culture has started in all those support mechanisms within our company. And if we can deliver just like they're our customer, then as our staff in the stores then carry it out to our guests that come in daily, that's what we're trying to drive is what's that culture look like? And for us, it's a culture of service. And it starts with service. And then expands out and grows as we develop relationship.
It's amazing. So what you're talking about is you're not saying, I'm going to go directly to the customer and only focus on the customer. You're focusing on the customer through the people that you bring into your business to work at Woods, whether they're a barista, whether they're in the main office, whatever it may be. You're focusing on what they need, what they want, bringing them into the culture, and then they ultimately reflect that to the customer is what you're saying.
Absolutely. So when our driver shows up in our store to deliver something and they take extra steps to serve the baristas that are working in that store, that sends a message, right? And that's what we want. We want that from the top down. So oftentimes I'll come into a store and, I'm just a regular guy, Granted, people, may think, oh my goodness, I got to produce something that, is pretty special here. The boss is here kind of thing. In the end, I don't want that. I want to be the least of those, I just want to be part of that service. So, it's how can I serve you, and oftentimes I'll ask, our staff, how are you doing? What can we do to serve you?
Simple question.
Yeah. How can we help? And so that's kind of the key. And it works, right? Because what happens is that then that service culture becomes something that they extend to our guests, and then our guests appreciate it so much that they tip them a lot of money, and the baristas are very happy.
That's awesome. So, and this is a tougher question, but for somebody in today's day and age that's looking to start a business or has a business right now, but may have somebody that's in their business that's not a good culture fit, what is that like for you? And has it gotten easier when somebody does not fit into the Woods culture? Is it easy for you? What's the process look like to identify somebody that's maybe not giving or is not part of that giving culture? How do you identify that? And are you a hire slow, fire fast? What is your recommendation for people that are having these issues?
All depends on the city.
Yeah.
We're from Linden, Washington to Bellevue, Washington. And the differences in those two cities could not be more stark.
What are some differences?
Yeah, the differences are that Linden has a strong work ethic, and people get the idea of service and what we do. And then you get into the bigger city of Bellevue, where the unemployment rate is less than 1%, and people have so much money that their kids don't have to go to work, and so it creates an interesting dynamic where we in those settings may be hiring people that take more care in how we have to get them up to the level of service that they need to know and that they need to deliver. It is also a big difference between a town and an area, Whatcom County, where we're well known, versus an area where we're not as well known. So if in this community, and we're in Bellingham today. We're just outside Bellingham. That people know the brand, they know the culture, they know what to expect. In Bellevue, we're the new guys on the block. People don't quite understand that. And so our staff has to be that much more intuitive. It has to be more ingrained in what we do to be able to deliver that service. So it is a little bit complicated. Yes, fire fast. We typically don't fire many people. They usually either decide, you know what, I don't fit in this culture, and they will leave on their own. I was just talking with a manager last week in one of our stores in Bellingham that had the entire staff in 2019 never changed.
It's amazing. It's a good manager.
It is. And it's great opportunity for us to say, you know, well, how do we do that, you know, more often?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How do we duplicate that?
Yeah.
So, okay. So let's talk about a scenario. And we talked a little bit about this before. You're going into a new market. First of all, how do you identify a new market, especially a Linden size market versus a Bellevue size market with different demographics, the kids that don't have to work as much, whatever it may be? How do you analyze a new market? And then you see Starbucks on three corners, and you identify the fourth corner. How do you go into that market? How do you compete?
Not easily. You know, it's complicated. It's a different environment for us because the volume is higher. And so we make our money on the real estate side. I know you'll appreciate that. The real light bulbs going off, right? Yep. Real estate side for us is the key. We have to build that foundation, and we do that diligently by looking at a lot of different spaces and negotiating rates that are favorable that make the entire scenario work. Because if we get into a position where we're paying way too much for real estate, then it just puts more pressure on everything else in that setting to make it work. So now you're talking about some of the most valued real estate in our state is in those areas where we're growing, and it's harder to find those spaces. And so we work really hard to find locations that work and locations that work really well. And it's not the kind of growth or as fast paced of growth as we'd like, but it is what it is because of what we can get. And we're not the number one choice. You get a much higher cap rate if you're bringing a Starbucks to the table than if you're bringing a Woods to the table. It's just a fact, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have to carve out our space, and we compete, and we work hard to find one of our busiest store. A great story is that one day a guy calls me from Linden and says, "Hey, I've got a guy that I know that has a site in Bellevue where he says he can get you drive-through." And I said, "Well, that doesn't sound right. There's no coffee shops with drive-through in Bellevue." And he says, "No, the guy's legit." So call him, and we work on it for about 2 years. And we actually open a store that's next to Chick-fil-A in Bellevue that is now our number one store. And so,
fantastic.
Like those are the little things, like, somebody gives you a lead from Linden, about a place in Bellevue. And then there's, other examples of that. And you know what? The funny thing, of all the real estate that we've talked about today and all the stuff we've talked about Woods, we have not once mentioned the most prized piece of real estate that we occupy.
I know the one you're going to talk about.
Boulevard Park.
How did you find that? How did you find that, but how did that happen?
Yeah. Great story. The city of Bellingham, and by the way, let's go back a little bit in history. That was a log mill that was in that area. And the building that we occupy there was the boiler room for the log mill. The log mill eventually burns down, and there's a number of people in the city that gather pieces of land in there and buy and to create the park. Okay, and the park then started in the 70s and then kind of grew, and then was really monumental when they built Taylor Dock, and now you can go on the walkway, and it's spectacular. And by the way, the name of the log mill that occupied that space early on was E.K. Woods Log Mill.
So it was meant to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a natural fit. So the city decides in about 12 years ago, that they want to put out an RFP, a request for proposal, to somebody take that space because it's just sitting there and they're using it as a paint shop. So as they build stuff for the parks, they would just take stuff, put it in there, and they'd use it as a paint room. And there's paint on the floor, and it's just kind of a funny little space. And if you remember back in those days, there weren't a lot of windows in that space. It was just concrete block, and the building had been used as a boat building facility for a few years. And I have some pictures of that. Pretty unique. So anyway, the city goes out, puts this RFP out, and we see it in a newspaper that says the city is requesting this proposal, and we submit. And we go up against probably, I think, 8 other people at that point that had submitted plans. And ours was the best plan. And we were just all, shooting from the hip. We had pictures and diagrams because, who's going to go to Linden to look at our stores? Because at that point, we didn't have any examples in Bellingham. And so we show them pictures and I guess give them a great enough pitch where they said, okay, we want you to occupy that space. So people oftentimes say that we had favor or that, all this kind of stuff. In the end, we competed with a few other people, but not a lot of legitimate businesses that could actually pull it off. But prior to that, the city had already gone to several local businesses and asked them. They'd gone to Starbucks and asked them, and everybody said, no, far too risky. It'll never work. And then we start.
The sunsets aren't good enough down there.
Yeah. Something like that. Yeah. So we start building out the space. And it takes about a year from the time we start building out the space until we open. And we're way behind schedule, and there's many reasons why. But all that time, people would come through the park, and they would, stop and say, hey, what are you guys doing? I mean, you're spending a fortune here. This place can only be open 3 months a year. It's destined for failure. And so, we heard that, but we knew that it was going to be just great. And I remember, you can kind of get beaten down, and by the very end, we're on fumes. We barely have enough money to finish this thing off. And I show up a half an hour before we're going to open on that first day, and there's a line of about 20 people. And I thought, okay, this is going to work.
The vision.
Yeah.
And so just quick, more real estate question. When it comes to when you open a new location, are you looking to lease or do you purchase, or is there a blend in your portfolio of the Woods locations?
We typically like to lease. Our belief is that we want to take our capital and keep it moving, building new stores. There's examples both ways. Starbucks is very much like what we do. They only lease property. But then you got McDonald's, who's one of the greatest real estate holders in the United States. So you can do it both ways.
Very good. Yeah, and again, just more. There's different ways of going about it, and also, would you agree that it depends on the style of business that you have?
Absolutely, and it all comes down to capital.
Yeah.
In our case, we like to keep our capital moving and working, and we're not a highly capitalized business. We build based on profitability. So it's not like we've just got this big, huge nest egg that we've built over these years, and we can just keep growing. It's like, hey, we're still doing it one step at a time. Make some money. Now we'll go open a new store.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And Wes, tell me a little bit about yourself. You're not from Washington originally. You had a journey to get up here.
So yes, I am not originally from this area. I grew up I was born in Canada, grew up in Colombia, South America, and then California a lot of my life, and then here in Washington. I ended up here because I would travel from California to visit my grandfather in Canada, and coming through here a lot, realized that this would be a great place to raise our family. And so at a point when our kids were 5 to 12 years old, 4 kids, we decided to move to Washington to get them out of California. We bought a little farm out by Weiser Lake, and we just settled down. It was a great place for the kids to grow up. We had horses and motorcycles and tractors, and it's just been a magical time living here for the last 26 years.
Very cool. And so when you guys moved from California, you were not in the coffee business before you came up here.
No.
But you had seen growing up And how long were you in Colombia for? Let's
7 years.
7 years. So you'd seen a coffee culture. You'd seen a culture that has coffee ingrained in the culture, right?
It's not that way. When you go into coffee growing regions, South America, they don't drink a lot of coffee, and it's not a part of they wouldn't sit here in a meeting like this and drink coffee like this. It's just not part of the culture, and they will actually take great strides to find inferior coffee so that they don't drink the best stuff. The best stuff is exported because that's where the money is.
Understand.
And so in growing up in South America, I didn't know anything about coffee. So it's a great mental connection. When I say I grew up in Colombia, people already imagine that I'm running with a cartel. And we're running coffee, and we're exporting and doing all this kind of stuff.
I already have the image in my head.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm just a kid. I've grown up in South America. I speak Spanish, and it's just one of those things. But I, later in life, you asked about I wasn't in coffee in California. No, I was not. I started after high school working in a cabinet shop and working with my hands, learning a trade. And then bought that business. That was the first business I ever bought. And then from there, parlayed that into a large company where we were remodeling very expensive homes in Southern California. And that's how we'd made our money in California.
How did you go from working in the cabinet shop to building up enough of an income, enough of a savings to be able to buy the business? What was that process like for you to be able to do that?
Right.
This is your first business that you bought, right?
Yeah. And I'm an entrepreneur, so it's not like I did as you described. It wasn't logical like that. I didn't go about,
I
saying,
can relate.
Yeah, if I put one foot in front of the other and save as much money as I possibly can, someday I'll be able to afford what I really want. That's not how an entrepreneur thinks. An entrepreneur thinks, here is the opportunity. How do I go out and find the money to make that work? Mm-hmm. And I had always grown up in a real estate rich environment. My father was a pastor, but he was diligent about real estate and investing in real estate. And so I had just grown up with the idea that you find ways to find your capital, and it's usually using other people's money. And how do we do that? And so when the opportunity came up when I was 21 years old, and we were going to buy this business, I found ways to find the capital to buy that business.
So what you're saying that maybe the standard person, I don't want to generalize everybody, but maybe the person that's not an entrepreneur thinks, I need to save up for X amount of years, and I need to do it at this increment. And what you're saying is, instead of doing that for people that are listening, it's important that you find the opportunity and you figure out a way to make it work.
And that's what an entrepreneur does, right? When schools teach entrepreneurship, I'm not a firm believer that you can be taught entrepreneurship. We have a great school here at the University of Washington. Western Washington University that teaches entrepreneurship, and I think it's really more about risk management. And if entrepreneurs could be taught one thing, it would be managing risk. Because I think that most entrepreneurs are not afraid of risk. In fact, that's kind of what keeps them going and motivated.
Do you think it takes almost an incredibly strong belief in yourself or in what you believe as well?
Yeah, because that's the number one killer of most people's entrepreneurial journey is that once their hand is slapped once, they don't want that to happen again. So most entrepreneurs, though, that are true entrepreneurs that will dive deep and keep going are those people that will get their hands slapped many times and just keep going back. I've heard a friend describe in one business that they're in that they look for people who have been rejected 200 times, but they believe that next time is going to be the magic bullet. So that's a lot what entrepreneurs do. I don't think we're afraid of failure. And I've failed. I've failed miserably. I have fallen on my face. I've lost it all. When I talked about being 35 years old and having enough money in Southern California to retire and do whatever we wanted, It was only at that moment when I had a life-threatening illness that took me completely out of business. Economy shifted in Southern California, and we lost 100% of everything we'd ever built to that point. And so then it was like, okay, we've got nothing left to hold us here in Southern California. That's why we moved to Washington.
It's time to go.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit more about that illness, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
When I was traveling here in Washington visiting, we were meeting with some friends, and we went to a park, and I got bit by a mosquito. And that mosquito carried a virus that attacks the brain. It's encephalitis is the name of it. So I had a case of viral encephalitis that attacked my brain. It swells the brain, the blood doesn't flow, and you die. And that was typical. There were 7 people that contracted the same thing the same weekend that I was in that park. And out of those 7, I'm the only one that lived. And it was a dramatic time, traumatic as well. And I endured about a year of healing, and then about a 5-year period of recovery.
So you're in a park, you contract encephalitis, and 6 other people contract the same thing. You survive. This is at a time when is this after you had moved up here?
No, this is before we moved, 1 year before we moved.
So it's a good introduction to Washington. Welcome to Washington.
Yes.
Wow.
I've thought, you know what? This is my home. If I can go to a place where there's mosquitoes that have illness, I'm all in.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Magnet. Yay. Yeah. So, and this is at a time just after you had lost everything,
mm-hmm.
as far as real estate goes, right?
Yeah. So I get the mosquito bite. I'm down for the count for a year. And during that time, all real estate in Southern California was cut virtually in half. And so we'd never seen that in Southern California. I had never heard about that. And, it caught everybody by surprise. And we were highly leveraged in real estate at that point. And, we're not in a good place. Fortunately, 6 months prior to that, I had purchased a disability policy and a private disability policy from an insurance company. And now a year after the original illness, I'm realizing, I could probably draw on that. And so I did. And that's really what gave us the opportunity to heal, which is exactly what it was meant to do,
mm-hmm.
right? And so we moved to Washington and set up here and start living our lives, go about this. And what we didn't talk about was the concept of time, right? So this is 1993 that I moved to Washington. And in 1995, 98, we come to an end with the disability policy. It's a 5-year policy, and we're done, and we sign an agreement, say, you're not coming after me, we won't come after you. It's a good business relationship. We're done. And so now we go another 4 years. So 9 years after we moved to Washington, we have now started the Woods Coffee. And maybe the years don't line up quite right as I'm telling it, because I'm forgetting it's too many years down the road now. And so in 2002, we start the Woods Coffee. And in 2002, one day I get a knock on the front door in the evening, and it's 2 men in suits. Just like you'd see in the movies, they got the thin tie, dark coat, and they flash badges, and they're from the FBI. They said, hey, we're investigating you on a count of mail fraud. And I said, I don't understand what that means or what this is all about. And they said, well, you sent a check across state lines, and that allowed us to open up a case with your disability policy. And so then when I thought back on it I realized that when we came to that end and signed this agreement with the insurance company, they said at that point, hey, we gave you 61 checks instead of 60. We need you to mail us back a check. And so we did. And when we did that, it created this opportunity for them to bring in the feds to investigate this case. And as I learned later, this is common practice. And they come in and the feds investigate, and then they build this case, and they say, hey, you know what? We believe that you fraudulently purchased the insurance. that you faked the illness and you fraudulently collected on the insurance, and we're going to put you in prison for 5 years. And we want $750,000. And so these are sobering things that, as a businessman, doesn't matter how long you've been in business. And in this case, we're in business less than a year. And, we're still, we're working diligently to pull this thing off. We don't know if we can pull off this Woods Coffee thing. And now we're facing this 5-year prison thing and so on and so forth. We work through a number of things. And in the end, I signed an agreement to accept a 1-year prison sentence as opposed to going against the federal government and burning up about $500,000 to fight this. And I accept a 1-year prison sentence. And so 1 year into the woods, I leave for a year to go serve a prison sentence.
It's impeccable timing, isn't it?
Yeah. Leaving my wife, 4 kids, 2 teenage boys, to make this all happen and pull it off. And I literally told her, I don't know if this is going to be here when I get back. Do what you can, do our best. We do have this other lube shop business, and I've set it up so that it'll make a little bit of money this year and should be the only income that you really need, and it should make it happen. And the problem was that I left, and the guy that was running the lube shop business decided that he could do things better and ended up...
Another entrepreneur.
Yeah, wannabe.
Yeah.
And ended up losing money as opposed to making money. And so came back a year later, and as I told you, the business has kind of turned. The month that I left to go to prison is when they turned from red to black and started making money.
And this is Pender Road, and then it would be off of, is it Main Street?
It was Safeway, next to Safeway in Linden. And both those stores were rocking along. And, I'm on front page of the Bellingham Herald 2 days in a row before I leave to go to prison. And yet the community rallied and said, no, we like this brand and we're going to support it. And so come back and, overcome that time. And, we could spend an entire podcast talking about prison life and how that works and how it works in this situation where you've got, a family and a business and, the life in prison and how that all works. And it's a crazy, crazy story. But, we survived, and only by the grace of God, we overcame and were able to continue on, and that the business was here, and we've grown it since then.
That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. And my last question to you is, you had this point of time where you're grinding away. You have these 2 locations. You're not making any money yet. You're in the red at that point, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have this lube shop that you trusted a partner to take care of it, so it would take care of your family as well. You accept this fate of going to prison for a year, and I'm sure you learned a lot between that span of time, because there's a lot of life converging on that exact moment.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say was your biggest takeaway from all of that convergence at one time?
You don't want to have to go through it again.
Yeah.
1.
Yeah.
2, when you're going through that, you really, rely on the things that are the most important to you. It becomes, the thoughts of your family and, how they support you. And trust me, I would not be here today if my father hadn't stepped in and supported, our family while I was gone. That's meaningful stuff. I have a strong faith, and I really believe that God provided for us during that time and allowed us to survive. And it's one of those times that you don't want to have to do over again, but you can learn so much during those times that you can't replace the value of that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Thanks so much for being vulnerable and being who you are and just showing up today in this snowball that we're in right now, and sliding down the road here to make it. We really appreciate you being here, and thanks for joining us on Building Bellingham.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks
to Wes for making the time out here in the snow to be here. Thanks again for tuning in to Building Bellingham. We're actually all here at Binary Studios. We are snowed in, having a great time, and committed to bringing you guys more quality content and bring you more life lessons from entrepreneurs and business owners here in the area. For more information and links to all of Woods Coffee's social media, visit www.livebellinghamnow.com/blog. Again, I'm your host, Leo Cohen with the Cohen Group Northwest. This episode was produced and edited by David Pender Lofgren. It was recorded and mixed by Andy Rick at Binary Studios. Our social media Jedi is Cooper Hansley.
And our blogger is Tiffany Holden.
Our theme music was written and performed by Aaron Guest, and our logo was designed by Sam Vogt. Building Bellingham is a proud member of the BellPod Network, a collective of independent podcasts made right here in the city of subdued excitement.